Good evening, visitors. Welcome to the Australian War Memorial's Last Post ceremony, which today marks the commencement of the sitting year for the 45th Parliament of Australia. My name is Richard Cruz, and joining us today from the Royal Australian Navy is Captain Lisa Batchelor. This evening we will hear the story of Private William James Johnson, who was an active participant in Australian politics but was killed during the First World War. We are honoured this evening to welcome the Honourable Malcolm Turnbull, Prime Minister of Australia, the Honourable Bill Shorten, Leader of the Opposition, Senator the Honourable Stephen Parry, President of the Senate, the Honourable Tony Smith, Speaker of the House of Representatives, Air Chief Marshal Mark Binskin, Chief of the Defence Force Australia, and Mrs Git Binskin, Lieutenant General Perry Lim, Chief of the Defence Force Singapore, and Mrs Lynn Lim, Senator the Honourable Maurice Payne, Minister for Defence, the Honourable Richard Marles, Shadow Minister for Defence, the Honourable Dan Tehan, Minister for Veterans Affairs, the Honourable Amanda Rishworth, Shadow Minister for Veterans Affairs, Mr Peter Everly, President, ACT State Branch, Returned and Services League of Australia, Rear Admiral Ken Doolan, representing the Chairman of the Council of the Australian War Memorial, and Dr Brendan Nelson, Director of the Australian War Memorial. We also warmly welcome all members and senators of the 45th Parliament of Australia and members of the Defence Force. Shortly, Australia's Federation Guard will dismount the catafalque party from the tomb of the unknown Australian soldier within the Hall of Memory. Australia's Federation Guard is a tri-service ceremonial unit of the Australian Defence Force. It provides a ceremonial presence during visits to Australia by foreign dignitaries and for civil and military events, including here at the Australian War Memorial. Today marks the commencement of the sitting year for the 45th Parliament of Australia and honours the 2 million men and women who wear and have worn the uniform of the Royal Australian Navy, Australian Army and Royal Australian Air Force. We gather here in the commemorative area of the Australian War Memorial to reflect on the legacy of political, economic and religious freedoms that we now enjoy. At times, these freedoms have come at a great cost to the nation, to the Australian Defence Force, and also to the families of those who have served in uniform. Here with us today are the men and women elected by Australia to make the decisions that build our nation, including the deployment of members of the Australian Defence Force across the globe, in our uniform, under our flag and in our name. These decisions are not made lightly. The cost of war is not only evident here on the Roll of Honour around us, but in the physical and emotional toll on the veterans who have served in conflicts, on operations and as peacekeepers. Our nation will pause this year to reflect on Australia's fighting on the Western Front and the bloody battles of Bullecourt, Ypres, Polygon Wood and Beersheba. So too we will commemorate the 75th anniversary of the fall of Singapore, the Kokoda campaign, the bombing of Darwin, Japanese midget submarines attack in Sydney Harbour, and the 70th anniversary of the Australian peacekeepers. These and others shaped and defined our nation. Today, as the members of the 45th Parliament commence their sitting year, we are reminded that Australians have a deep responsibility to always remember the service of those that have paid the ultimate sacrifice in the defence of us, our nation and our values. I would now like to invite the Prime Minister of Australia, the Honourable Malcolm Turnbull, to the lectern.
Thank you very much. I acknowledge that we are gathered today on the land of the Ngunnawal people, and we honour their elders past and present. You have acknowledged the many senior political representatives here, the Leader of the Opposition, the Speaker, Tony Smith, the President, Stephen Parry, my ministerial colleagues, Dr Nelson, the Chief of the Defence Force and Defence Chiefs, Rear Admiral Doolan, men and women of the Australian Defence Force, fellow Australians all. We are here in this place of quiet contemplation and remembrance. And it sits here on this side of the lake, gazing across at the Parliament, a place of contemplation which is not always quiet. But all of the freedoms we enjoy in Australia, all of the freedoms that we deliver, that we exercise in our Parliament, have been hard won and bravely won by the men and women remembered here in this place. The memorial's roll of honour of more than 102,000 names reminds us of the scale of the sacrifice that has been made to defend Australia and Australia's values over more than a century. And it reminds us too, this quiet, solemn reminder, an eternal reminder to us, the politicians and the Prime Ministers and the Ministers. It reminds us all that there are no more heavy responsibilities, no more momentous decisions that we can make than sending our men and women of the Australian Defence Force into harm's way. And it is our responsibility, as we remember them and honour them, honour their sacrifice and honour their descendants in the ADF today, it's our responsibility never to put them in harm's way. unless they are well led, well supported, and we have done everything we can as the leaders of this nation to ensure that they can do their duty and return safely home. This is a year of centenaries and anniversaries. You've mentioned some of them: Bullecourt, Messine, Passchendaele, Beersheba, Polygon Wood. And from the Second World War, the 75th anniversaries of Kokoda, El Alamein, Milne Bay, the fall of Singapore, the Battle of the Coral Sea, the bombing of Darwin, and the midget submarine attack on Sydney and Sydney Harbour. These, as we remember them, are some of the darkest days in our history. But every one of them is lit up by the courage of Australians. Every one is hallowed by the courage, the sacrifice, the heroism of Australians. And we must remember that those battles, those freedoms that have been won for us, were not won by gods. They were won by men and women, our grandfathers, our grandmothers, our great-grandfathers and great-grandmothers perhaps. They were Australians. Australians just like us, called into action to defend their nation. They came from bustling cities and close-knit country towns. They left homes and jobs and families behind. Private William James Johnson, who we remember today, died in 1916 on the Western Front of wounds sustained at Pozieres, was 45 years of age when he enlisted. He had been the Labor member for Robertson in the House of Representatives. He'd been elected in 1910. He lost his seat in 1913. He returned to his political career on Auburn Council, where he had been a councillor with the great Labor leader and future Premier of New South Wales, Jack Lang. In fact, Private Johnson succeeded Jack Lang by a few years. He had a wife of 27 years and he had 3 children. And he joined, he said, to set an example to the younger men. He was one of the ordinary but extraordinary Australians who found themselves doing extraordinary things to defend our freedom. In the crucible of the Great War, Australians forged a legend of courage and camaraderie, of mateship that has inspired us and formed our national character ever since. We see it in the selfless sacrifice of a century ago, and we see that spirit in their successes in the Middle East today. We see it in all the men and women who have fought and who have kept the peace around the world, from the battlefields of the Somme, Flanders, from the Pacific to the Western Sahara, from the jungles of Vietnam to the mountains of Afghanistan. Those whose valour earned them the highest honours, those who returned broken, and those who rest forever in distant oceans or in fields far from home. We don't remember them to glorify or to justify war, and we recognise that the best way always to honour the diggers of a century ago, to honour those who have paid the supreme sacrifice here, the best way to honour them is to look after the men and women of the ADF of today, the veterans and their families. And so, as we return to that house of freedom across the lake, the National Parliament, we will do so in the knowledge of the sacrifice and the magnitude of the sacrifice of those who served and those who died to keep us free. We could not do freedom's work without the service of the men and women remembered here around us, lest we forget.
Thank you, Prime Minister. I'd now like to invite the Leader of the Opposition, the Honourable Bill Shorten, to the lectern.
Good afternoon, everybody. And I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for those words and reminding us with that story of William Johnson that love of country knows no political creed. And I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. In particular, I acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who fought for an Australia that took too long to recognise their courage and their service. My fellow Australians, we gather here on sacred ground. For 75 years now, Australians have modestly made this very Australian pilgrimage, climbing these stairs to salute our honoured fallen, pausing to mourn, reflect, remember brave young Australians who never came home. And it is fitting that we, my parliamentary colleagues and I, who are entrusted with the tremendous privilege of representing the Australian people, come here on the eve of a new parliamentary year to pay our respects to all those that have given their lives so that our democracy may live. 100 years ago, village names on the other side of the world broke into the hearts of Australian families. Bulcourt, Messine, Passchendaele. In the Middle East, Beersheba. And 75 years ago, war came to the Pacific. Singapore fell. Thousands of Australians were captured. Japanese bombs rained on Darwin. And we fought back on land at Kokoda, in the Coral Sea, and in the air, with that 75th Squadron over Port Moresby, a unit citation perhaps too long in coming. The Australia of 1917 and 1942 has transformed far beyond the imaginations of those who fought in its name. We are more diverse, more inclusive, more equal. We are more confident of our place in the world and our ability to speak for our interests. And yet, for all that change, this memorial speaks a timeless truth. On the walls, we see the stories of everyday people, farmers and factory hands, dock workers and clerks, people who found within themselves the courage to face death, the loyalty to stand by one another, and the remarkable resilience to dust off and to do it again. For me, this memorial commands us to remember the best of Australia. Brave in hard times, strong in solidarity, reaching back to help a mate who's fallen off the pace. And commemoration is not just a public act. In this year of milestones, I encourage all Australians to reach back into their own family history, to speak to the keepers of their family trees and to seek out the stories of their own relatives who have served this country. Through a chance encounter at a family christening, I learned last year about two relatives of mine, brothers who fought and died at Gallipoli. Last year, my aunt told me about my grandmother's cousin, who on the Kokoda Trail volunteered for a mission sufficiently dangerous that they wouldn't let the married men volunteer. He never returned. Please talk to your older relatives who knew older generations. Talk to the people who know the stories behind the names on these walls. The stories of those who've given us a free country, a vibrant democracy, and a lesson in the enduring qualities of the people that we serve. When Parliament resumes tomorrow, conflict may be intense, but it'll be verbal. the weapons mere words. And despite how important we imagine our arguments to be, let us vow to remember all those Australians who faced a sterner test in a darker hour and paid a much higher price. And tonight at the going down of the sun, and tomorrow in the morning, let us renew Australia's oldest promise. We will remember them, lest we forget.
Thank you, Mr. Shorten. As always, but particularly today, we welcome the veterans who have served, those that are still serving and the families that support them. We acknowledge the members of RSL and Services Clubs Association, RSL Victoria and RSL Queensland, who are watching the broadcast of this ceremony around Australia. Could I ask you to please stand and join in singing the National Anthem. The Australian War Memorial was the vision of Charles Bean, Australia's First World War official historian. Bean landed with the Australian troops on Gallipoli and stayed with them at the front through to the end of the war. The idea of this national memorial and museum came to him at Pozières, France, in the depths of the bloody fighting of 1916. Bean's idea was that this would be a place where families and friends could mourn loved ones buried in faraway places. It would also be a place that could help all Australians understand what these men and women had endured and what they had done for us. Bean's vision, to which we remain true, is best expressed as inscribed in the entrance to the memorial's galleries. Here is their spirit, in the heart of the land they loved, and here we guard the record which they themselves made. Tonight we'll read the story behind just one of those on the Roll of Honour, which lists the names of more than 102,000 men and women who have given their lives for us in war and operations over more than a century. But first we present a lament, Flowers of the Forest. Wreaths and floral tributes will now be laid at the base of the Pool of Reflection. The Honourable Malcolm Turnbull, Prime Minister of Australia, and the Honourable Bill Shorten, Leader of the Opposition. Senator the Honourable Stephen Parry, President of the Senate, and the Honourable Tony Smith, Speaker of the House of Representatives. Air Chief Marshal Mark Binskin, Chief of the Defence Force Australia, and Mrs Get Binskin, and Lieutenant General Perry Lim, Chief of the Defence Force Singapore, and Mrs Lin Lim. Senator the Honourable Maurice Payne, Minister for Defence, and the Honourable Richard Marles, Shadow Minister for Defence. The Honourable Dan Tehan, Minister for Veterans Affairs, and the Honourable Amanda Rishworth, Shadow Minister for Veterans Affairs. Mr Peter Everly, President, ACT State Branch, Return and Services League of Australia. Rear Admiral Ken Doolan, representing the Chairman of the Council of the Australian War Memorial, and Dr Brendan Nelson, Director of the Australian War Memorial. Our final wreaths this evening will be laid by visitors to the memorial.
Today, we remember and pay tribute to Private William James Johnson. Popularly known as Bill, William Johnson was born in Yass on the 20th of January 1867 to William and Susan Johnson. After attending Orange Public School, he went on to become a coach builder. In 1889, he married Martha Burrell in Forbes, and the couple had a son and a daughter, Lachlan and Ivy. They also adopted a son, Eric Travis, after he was orphaned in 1908. Johnson became a well-known agent for the Allied Works Council. Such was his popularity that in 1910, he successfully campaigned for a seat in the House of Representatives in New South Wales, becoming the Labor member for Robertson. He failed in his re-election bid in 1913, but the following year was elected the Mayor of Auburn. He was described as a rough diamond, ready to extend what help lay in his power to those who needed it, and his honesty of purpose, both in his private as well as political life, has been freely commented on by all those who knew him. Johnson enlisted in the Australian Imperial Force on the 14th of August 1915. At 49 years of age, he was too old for active service, so he lied about his age, which he gave as 44. After passing the medical, he was posted to the 12th Reinforcements to the 2nd Battalion. At a function in December 1915, where he was formally farewelled by the Auburn Council, Johnson gave a speech saying that no man could appreciate more than he did all the kindness extended to him by the people of Auburn and the many expressions of good wishes for his welfare whilst on his hazardous trip abroad. After a number of postponements, which made him wonder if he would ever leave, he departed Sydney on the 30th of December 1915 on board the troopship Medic. He first travelled to Egypt before heading to the Western Front. After his arrival in France, Johnson, who had left Australia a corporal, reverted to the rank of private. He wrote home to say, "Physically, I am pretty fit, and I'm sure that if given luck enough to dodge the death-dealing implements of the Germans, I shall return home and live 10 years longer than if I had not enlisted." He added, "Australia is a great country, and her democratic institutions are worth defending. It is because of this that I took on this job, with the thousands of other Australians who have rallied and are rallying to that standard of liberty, the Union Jack." The 2nd Battalion first experienced conditions on the Western Front in a quieter sector of the line. Nevertheless, Private Johnson wrote in a letter to a friend, "Experienced men tell me that our turn in the front line, my first, was the hottest any Australians in this part of the line of battle have had to endure. And because they tell me so, I write with much confidence. We have plenty of cannonading, the incessant rattle of machine guns, and thousands of men contributed with their rifles to the expenditure of death-dealing missiles from both sides of no man's land. I never saw a really important engagement yet, though every day and night was spent with clothes and equipment on, in turn with the comrades in a never-ending vigil. It was always very interesting, and when the artillery on both sides began to bang parapets and dugouts with high explosive shells, it was almost exciting." Less than a fortnight later, Johnson had his chance to participate in an attack. On the 23rd of July 1916, the 2nd Battalion took part in an operation which captured the French village of Pozières. It was an important position which commanded a view of the German lines and had withstood a number of attacks by the British, and its capture was a significant achievement. During the battle, Private Johnson was struck in the head by a fragment of shell and was evacuated from the battlefield with a fractured skull. He was taken to hospital in Atapla, where he died of his wounds a week later. He was 50 years old. William Johnson is buried at Atapla military ceremony under the words, "At rest." His name is listed on the Roll of Honour to my right, among more than 60,000 Australians who died while serving in the First World War. This is but one of the many stories of service and sacrifice told here at the Australian War Memorial. We now remember Private William James Johnson, who gave his life for us, for our freedoms, and in the hope of a better world.
Please stand for the reading of the Ode and the sounding of the last post.
They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them.
We will remember them.
Party, praise and arms.
Lest we forget.
Lest we forget.
Catapult party out once. Turn. Catapult party. Quick. Arch.
We leave you this evening with the words of the memorial's founder, Charles Bean. Many a man lying out there at Pozières or in the low scrub at Gallipoli, with his poor, tired senses barely working through the fever of his brain, has thought in his last moments, well, it's over. But in Australia, they will be proud of this. Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes the last post ceremony. We do ask for your patience this evening in exiting the commemorative area. Please be mindful of those around you and follow the instructions of memorial staff as you make your way through to the front entrance. And we thank you for visiting the Australian War Memorial and wish you all a very good evening. Thank you.